Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my opinions on The Amazing Race Season 5 after my latest rewatch. And Season 5 was my #1 season of the show on my season ranking video. And after this rewatch, I do think that still holds. I mean, Season 5 is a fantastic season of reality television, and we have a lot to talk about, so let's just jump right into it. First, I want to start talking about the format changes from the previous seasons, because I do feel like this season did make some interesting adjustments after Season 4, which I do find to be a mostly boring season, like I talked about last time, and I think they realized that the show gave too much of an advantage to the alpha male teams. So in turn on this season, we only had one male team, and that was Marshall and Lance, obviously not a super alpha team. And we did get 3 female teams and a bevy of male-female teams. And obviously that does lead to more women making it further into the season. The season does also introduce the yield, which is the prototype for the U-turn. And the U-turn is better, obviously. But I did like that they started to add some social elements to the game. The non-elimination legs on this season did now include a penalty, which makes those episodes feel like they matter a bit more, which was a major criticism of mine for previous seasons, though. I mean, again, still not perfect. I still don't like non-elimination legs. Another format change was the reduction in the use of the fast forwards, where previously there would be a fast forward in every leg. This time around, though, they were rarely used. I mean, there were only, I believe, 2 in the entire season, which I don't know if I like this change or not. I actually did like the strategy of having to time when to use your fast forward. I did think that that was pretty fun. But this was also the season that did cause some future changes in the future with the roadblock rules, where later on there would be a limit on the number of roadblocks a person can do. And that's because here on this season, the final 3 teams all had one member doing all but one of the roadblocks, which I do think is obviously a massive flaw in the rules. But obviously, I think we should talk about the cast as well, which is one of the best in the history of the show. I mean, like any other cast, there is probably 1 or 2 dud teams, but that's kind of what you should expect from The Amazing Race. I mean, almost every other team on this season is fantastic. It has some really great moments, if not iconic moments. There's just so many like legendary teams here, and that's a lot of the reason why this season is as great as it is. But now we got that sort of stuff out of the way, let's go through the episodes one by one, starting off with the premiere, which was a pretty strong opening episode to this season, which again is an all-time great season of reality TV for me. But we did start off with the exact same intro as previous seasons. I mean, I did like the foreshadowing we got here from Colin, where he says he might be the most intense person to ever participate on the race. Yeah, I wonder. And we do see that pretty early off too, with like Colin pushing Dennis at the beginning of the race. And also at the beginning, Jim does get injured, and this does become a prominent storyline for this episode. We do also get Dennis and Erica making an alliance and getting into a lot of drama at the airport, where they try to get the same tickets for their alliance, only for those tickets to be the worst tickets. But this does end up pissing off a whole bunch of other teams and plays a factor later on in the episode. We do get a lot of great content from Charlotte and Myrna, who I know people find annoying, but I mean, I personally think they're 2 of the greatest characters in the history of the show. And in this episode, they're already getting on people's nerves. We already get this spiel about how Charla is stronger than people believe, and how they are strong, independent women, right before they go and beg for help from strangers, and talk about how strangers love to help Charla. Like, it's kind of a funny scene. And Myrna also struggling to carrying the beef in this episode is really fun. The scramble for the departure times was another fun scene in this episode, where it was interesting to see how the final 3 teams of the season do all end up getting the last departure time here. We also have some fun moments from Chip and Kim and Cammy and Carly, where they both get to the pit stop in first place, but it turns out that they didn't get the route marker to the detour, so they have to go all the way back to the detour, get the route marker, and then return, and that causes them to be 2 of the last teams to arrive, and they barely scrape by into the next round. But the decider during this episode was Dennis and Erica, again feeling bad for what they did at the airport. Dennis allows Colin and Kristy to get a taxi that they were competing for, and this causes them to be in last, and they never recover after this. And I like Dennis and Erica. I mean, despite them being the first boots here, I thought they had a pretty fun storyline this premiere. They weren't the most dynamic characters on their own, but they were put into a situation that caused a lot of drama. And because of that, I thought they were fun additions to this cast. very solid first boots. Now for episode 2, which was another pretty solid one, we started off with Chip and Kim and Cammy and Carly's relationship that does end up deteriorating by the end of the episode due to Chip's boastfulness when they thought that they were the bottom 2 teams. A lot of what makes this episode great for me, though, was Charlotte and Myrna. I love them as a team. They're just such fun characters. I mean, they have so many fun moments here, from asking a prostitute for directions and getting the boat that everyone else was already on to stop and wait for them. And we also had them at the cemetery getting off in the golf cart and telling the driver to leave everyone else behind. And the fact that they almost win this leg is also really fun. I mean, they do lose in a foot race to Brandon and Nicole at the very end, but again, they were really close there. We'd also get the storyline of Linda and Karen lying to Jim and Marcia about needing to exchange their currency, which obviously upsets Jim and Marcia, but I never fully understood if Linda and Karen actually did this or if it was just a complete miscommunication, as Linda and Karen never mention this. And they don't feel like the type of people that would do something like that. So I would think it's a miscommunication, but the show never really clarifies that. But this episode does also contain the fall of Allison and Donnie, who, again, had a massive fall from grace here, coming in first in the first leg to getting knocked out here. They argue the entire leg, and they have a really fun scene of them struggling to walk the dogs. But the thing that does cost them the race is Donnie wanting to save money, so instead of taking the taxi, which everyone else does, they end up taking the bus, and because that end up in last place. Allison and Donnie were a lot of fun on this season. Again, I like the 2-episode arc that they had here. It was interesting to see them on the race, with Allison obviously coming from Big Brother, being a massive figure at that point in Big Brother, and having her cheating on Donnie being a major storyline for season 4 of the show. And it was pretty clear they were going to be a cluster F of a team on here as well. And they were. I mean, they were a complete train wreck, and obviously that was their major appeal here. Now for episode 3, which was a bit of a weaker episode, but still not a bad one. I mean, we started off with Brandon and Nicole building an alliance with Charlotte and Myrna, who helped them out when they get stuck in the mud, only for Brandon and Nicole to then screw them over at the airport. Which, Brandon and Nicole screwing over people at the airport is kind of a trend we'll be seeing. I do also love how we see Colin helping the others, only then to get a confessional of him saying how he's only doing it to take advantage of them later on in the race. That was pretty great. Especially when we get the shot of his devious smirk immediately afterwards. Charlotte and Myrna do get into an argument with Marshall and Lance in this episode. And again, Charlotte and Myrna getting into arguments with teams is a trend for this season. But something I never understood here is the fall of Jim and Marcia. So what ends up happening is Jim and Marcia get to the best tickets first, but I don't get how everything got so messed up here, where they don't get all the tickets that they need, where on one of the flights that they're going on, they only have a ticket for Marcia and not for Jim. And obviously this is a fatal mistake, and this causes them to be behind the rest of the episode. And that's also another reason why the back half isn't as strong as the previous 2 episodes, as, again, it's very obvious Jim and Marcia are going home. I never understood how this happened. How does this circumstance even happen when other teams got on this flight? Whatever, who cares? They get eliminated. But there were other fun moments throughout this episode as well, like Colin shushing Kristy at the ticket counter. We had Charlotte and Myrna faking a sickness to get priority status on the flight. We had Marshall and Lance yelling, "Bitch!" to Charlotte and Myrna as they passed them on the road. And also the twins swimming to the pit stop instead of just walking in the shallow water was really funny. Again, overall, back half of the episode did drag because Marcia and Jim were the pretty obvious boots here. And Jim and Marcia, while they weren't the most dynamic team on the show, I did really like them. But them going home here was probably the right time. I thought they were, again, a really likable duo. They had prominent storylines like Jim's injured leg and their rivalry with Linda and Karen. And they were fine on the show. But again, at the end of the day, though, they're probably one of the more forgettable teams on the season. Now for episode 4, which I have a similar opinion of as the previous episode, where again, there were fun moments, but it's harmed by a very obvious boot. But we do get great moments like Colin and Myrna's argument at the bus station, where Myrna tries to talk to the guy that Colin's already talking to. We do get a lot of argument over the placement in line at the bus station. Also, Colin ends up buying all the available tickets to avoid Charlotte and Myrna from getting on the first bus. All this is really fun. This is a great segment of the episode. And this group that does get the better bus tickets do work together to get better flights, allowing Colin and Kristy to get the first flight out, while the others in this group do get on the second flight out, until Brandon and Nicole do what they do and get tickets on their own to arrive slightly earlier. The most memorable moment of the episode for me, though, was the Caviar Roadblock that Nicole and Kristy do, being the only roadblock that both of them do this entire season, and they really struggle with it. But this is a great scene, especially to see Chip come in and just breeze through it, and that allows Chip and Kim to win their first leg here. But as I said, though, it was pretty obvious that Bob and Joyce were in last. They were going to be last from very early on. I mean, they had trouble booking tickets. They booked business class tickets initially, and they just really couldn't recover from that. Bob and Joyce, I mean, they were fine on the show. I mean, I think the dynamic of having an older dating couple was interesting, but they really brought nothing to the season. I mean, they are one of the only true duds on this cast, in my opinion. But that being said, they are better than most of the duds from other seasons. Like, they still had some moments in an interesting relationship, but again, they were just fine. Now for episode 5, which is definitely the slowest episode so far, possibly of the season. I was just kind of bored during this episode. I mean, it was a non-elimination episode, so not much here actually mattered. I do feel like it lacked the fun character moments that we got from previous episodes. Colin and Kristy do come in first after getting the best flight and getting the fast forward. The only real fun moments from this episode were Charlotte and Myrna at the airport finding a better flight under everybody else's nose and sneaking to the gate while everyone else was sleeping, and Chip and Kim and the twins reconciling at the end of the episode. So, I mean, that's something. Linda and Karen do end up in last, but again, it was a non-elimination leg, so who cares? But this did introduce the new twist of having the saved team have to give up all their money, and it was fine. I mean, obviously it was flawed from the aspect of it was not a great look for Americans overseas to be begging for money from less fortunate people, but also it was just too easy for them to get money back. Because as we see on this season, there was no rule for them not being able to beg money in between legs. So that's what a lot of people did. And through that, they would more times than not end up with more money than they would have gotten on the next leg anyway. So it's like, it is kind of pointless. And I do think it's better that they did change this for the future. But now for episode 6, which was another solid episode. Not as strong as the first few, but pretty good. I mean, it had some really iconic moments, most of which having to do with Charlotte, Myrna, and Colin and Kristy's feud, where they argue over a taxi, and later Myrna calls Colin out for having a Napoleon complex. Linda and Karen do go to the wrong airport and barely make the flight, and that does end up being a massive equalizer as everyone ends up on it. Even Colin and Kristy, despite starting with a 7-hour lead on everyone. Linda and Karen do end up begging for money, as I said. Again, it's just not really fun to watch them actually do that. But this leg really comes down to the Scarab Roadblock, which is your typical needle in a haystack sort of challenge. It's the only roadblock that Kim does this entire season, which again is a flaw in the system, but whatever. None of this really does end up mattering, though, as Marshall and Lance end up quitting due to Marshall's knee giving him a lot of pain, which has been foreshadowed for the last few episodes. But for them to just quit in the middle of the roadblock was kind of anticlimactic. I do love how Marshall says at the end of the episode, though, that Lance had no quit in him. It's like, you guys literally just quit. What are you talking about? Like, Lance is literally the one that says, it's done, it's over. Like, what are you talking about? But Marshall and Lance, I mean, they were fine on this season. I mean, they had their feud with Charlotte and Myrna, but outside of that, and Marshall's knee, I guess, I mean, they were kind of one of the least important teams left. They didn't really get much screen time outside of that. Really, that wasn't until their last couple episodes. Now for episode 7, which was fine. Another solid one with some fun moments throughout. We got confrontation between Charlotte, Myrna, and Colin and Kristy again at the airport, which does get somewhat physical. And Colin and Kristy do end up building an alliance with most of the other teams to screw over Charlotte and Myrna. Only for Charlotte and Myrna to end up getting the better flight and have everyone try to change their flights to Charlotte and Myrna's flight, which does end up happening. There were some fun interactions, though, in the office where Charlotte and Myrna would close the blinds to hide in there, and Myrna would tell the worker not to help Colin because he's violent. After that, the episode does slow down a bit, but there was still some intrigue with Charlotte and Myrna and the bowling moms getting delayed. And the situation with the really shady bus drivers was interesting to watch, though a bit uncomfortable as well. I feel like this is a situation production would definitely try to avoid in the modern day. We did get the Ostrich Egg challenge, which was pretty funny to watch Colin get pissed at the judge when he declared that his bowl wasn't full. But we did end the episode with the biggest tragedy of all. We lost Charlotte and Myrna. in a pretty anticlimactic way too. It didn't really feel like it was their time to go. And again, they were my favorite part of the season up to this point. So to see them leave the show here was a pretty big blow, but thankfully Colin and Kristy pick it up from this point on. But obviously Charlotte and Myrna do return for All Stars and have a pretty fun run on that season as well, with more feuds as you would expect. Again, they were just TV gold. I know people found them annoying, but I always found their complaining and hypocrisy to be comical. They're probably one of my favorite teams in the history of the race. And now for episode 8, which has an iconic first half, but a really average second half. The cab ride to the airport is just amazing. Starting off with a bunch of the teams being upset at the $100 price, with Colin and Kristy notably saying that they wouldn't pay their taxi driver if they get passed, and proceed to get passed by both Brandon and Nicole and Linda and Karen. And eventually they do also get a flat tire, which leads to more angry Colin and him berating the taxi driver. And by the grace of Cammy and Carly being nice, they do get a new tire and continue on, while Linda and Karen's car does end up stopping, putting them on the last charter flight. But a prominent storyline in this episode is the use of money, where Chip really tips big, leading to Kim's disapproval, and Brandon and Nicole also argue over their use of money. But the really iconic moment here, possibly my favorite moment in the history of The Amazing Race, is Colin almost getting arrested here for refusing to pay his taxi driver the full $100, to the point where they go all the way to the police station, and watching Colin freak out over just $50 is hilarious to watch. Again, it's one of my favorite moments in all of reality television. To also see them just leave the police station with Colin just throwing the money in the air, it's so funny. Like, everything about this scene's so great. The point where, like, Colin freaks out yelling, "There's no contract!" Like, everything about this is great. One of the best moments ever. But after this, the episode does really slow down. I mean, this rest of the episode starts to focus a lot on the race and the tasks. Again, not as many character moments. There was the stuff with Chip and Kim being $10 short on their cab ride, but they get through it nonetheless. And the leg is really determined by Cammy and Carly deciding to go on the wrong detour and having to wait because of that. And again, they come in last, but it was a non-elimination leg, so whatever. But now for episode 9, which was another non-elimination leg. But despite that, I do think it was a pretty strong episode. We do start off with Cammy and Carly begging for money, which again, isn't a great look. And the airport stuff in this episode is pretty tame, with everyone getting on the same flight. Though we do get some intrigue from Chip and Kim taking a taxi to the airport instead of driving there, losing them time. We do get a lot of foreshadowing in this episode, though, from Chip and Kim talking about building Colin's ego and making him make a mistake, and about how they weren't going to use the yield now, but they might have to in the future. Again, a lot of foreshadowing there. Linda and Karen's taxi issues were a lot of fun this episode as well, but the episode's result was mostly dictated by the fast forward, which Brandon and Nicole decided to head to, only to find out that's the now infamous head shaving challenge. And because of that, Brandon and Nicole, who are models in real life, decide not to do it, leading to them being behind for the rest of the leg, and they do end up coming in last. But again, it doesn't matter because it was a non-elimination leg. But I did think we had a really fun reaction from Brandon and Nicole here, as, again, if you were on the race, you would think that this would be an elimination leg, because it's very rare for them to do 2 in a row. For episode 10, it was a largely average episode for me. There isn't much of note here. I did find it humorous how Cammy and Carly lied about having reservations, hoping to get on the plane. But again, that was never really going to work out. I did also like the moment where Brandon wanted to stop and pray in the middle of the detour, only for Nicole to turn him down. That was pretty funny. But the main intrigue of the episode comes from Chip and Kim being ready to use the yield, but decide against it, thinking that the bowling moms were way behind them. But it turns out they were wrong. I mean, they were pretty much tied for last with Cammy and Carly. But at the end of the day, it doesn't end up mattering, as Cammy and Carly mess up like they usually do and come in last and get eliminated. And I like Cammy and Carly as characters. I mean, they really just couldn't do anything right on the race, and it was just funny to watch them stumble through. But still, somehow they made it all the way to the final 5. And I believe they do have the record, or at least they did have the record for most second to last finishes in season. So, I mean, that's something. Again, it was just surprising to see them get as far as they did, but it was pretty clear that they were never going to win this thing. Now for episode 11, which is another non-elimination episode, but it's probably the most iconic non-elimination episode ever. I mean, the first half of the episode is kind of average, where we do get some moments like Linda and Karen arguing out of nowhere over directions, and Colin and Kristy missing their flight, leaving them tied with the other teams. But this leads to them being the last ones to get out of the airport, leading to them getting yielded by Chip and Kim, which again, as I said, was foreshadowed before. which again is also the first use of the yield on this season of the show, and I guess technically on any season of the show. But this kind of starts the fall of Colin and Kristy, and they're never really able to get back on top after this. I mean, I guess they kind of do at the beginning of the final leg, but we'll talk about that later. But something I did find pretty interesting here about the yield was that the yield was actually right in front of the task, so it allowed Colin and Kristy to watch the others do the task, which was putting together a car, and in turn, Colin and Kristy were able to do it quicker than the other teams. So they weren't as far behind as what they could have been, but they were still at the back of the pack. And I think watching Colin and Kristy from behind is the most interesting way to watch. I think they're the most entertaining at that point because they are so super competitive. That leads to a lot of fun character moments, like Kristy telling the driver to run people over, and obviously the really iconic "my ox is broken" moment from this episode, which is just a hilarious temper tantrum from Colin. Again, one of the most iconic moments in the history of the show. But overall, this is obviously just a terrible day for Colin and Kristy, and they do end up coming in last. But as I mentioned, it was a non-elimination leg, so it didn't really end up mattering. But it was a fun episode nonetheless. Now we're at the finale, which is a really strong one. I mentioned seasons 2 and 3's finales as two of the best in the series, and this one's right up there. I mean, starting with the final 4 leg, where we see Colin and Kristy coming in from the previous leg, where Kristy is pissed off at Chip and Kim, and when the leg starts, it's Linda and Karen versus Colin and Kristy, and they are instantly fighting for last due to them getting on the later charter flight. And this struggle is what makes this leg so great, where it goes back and forth between the two, and at the point where the bowling moms go to the correct island while Colin and Kristy go to the wrong one, it looks like Colin and Kristy are done for. But then we get to the roadblock, and Karen is just having so much trouble climbing, and we cut Colin running in there and just blows through it, blows past her, and makes an incredible comeback, eliminating Linda and Karen. And Linda and Karen were fun on the show. I mean, they had a really fun dynamic of being really supportive of each other, but also being really prone to arguments at points. And they were a team that I remembered coming into my previous rewatch. And while I don't think that they had as many individual iconic moments, they were just a fun presence on the show. And I am surprised that we haven't seen them back on The Amazing Race since then. Though considering The Amazing Race is pretty sparse with its returnees, that was obviously a major factor in that. But now we're at the final leg, which does start off pretty slow, pretty much until the detour, where we do get Brandon and Nicole trying out the bike detour, which causes Nicole to have a pretty major meltdown. That reminded me a lot of like a meltdown that we would see from Flo. But getting to the airport at the point where they're getting on the last flight of the race, Colin and Kristy are in first, Brandon and Nicole are in second. They both get on the same flight, only for it to get delayed in the middle of the night. And seeing Brandon, Nicole, and Colin and Kristy racing around the airport, trying to change up their flights was really fun. They do end up on standby on the most important flight, the actual flight to Dallas itself, but they aren't allowed to change flights due to having checked baggage at their previous flight. And that's pretty much what ends up deciding the race. As obviously Chip and Kim, being in last place, they were able to get on the best flight because they knew that the other flight was canceled. So while Colin and Kristy do make up some time due to having a prearranged taxi and doing very well at the final challenge, they couldn't make up the time deficit, and because that Chip and Kim win this season, almost entirely due to luck. I mean, they essentially did so bad in the first half of the leg that they were late enough to learn about the flight being delayed and being able to plan around that, while the other two teams who technically did everything right based on how you should be racing, they end up getting screwed over because of a really weird circumstance where first off their flight gets delayed, making it so they don't get on that initial flight, but then they also get screwed over by checking in their baggage, which makes it so they can't transfer flights. Well, that being said, I do think Chip and Kim winning at the end is a satisfying conclusion from a storytelling standpoint, even though I don't think they're the best racers in the world. But let's talk about the final 3 here, starting with Brandon and Nicole, who I liked on the show. I mean, they did seem to be less prominent on the show than I remembered, especially compared to the other 2 finalists, but they did have their fun moments with their cutthroat gameplay, their arguing nature. And they were a team that I actually did remember from when I was a kid, even though, ironically, I didn't remember the next team that we'll be talking about, and that is Colin and Kristy. And at this point, I think Colin and Kristy are my favorite team in the history of The Amazing Race. And it's so weird because, like, again, as I said, as a kid, I just didn't remember them. I remembered the other 5 teams of the final 6. But for some reason, Colin and Kristy just didn't stick to my mind. It's really weird considering that they are pretty much the stars of the back half of this season. And they're iconic characters due to Colin's hot-headedness, to Kristy's pettiness, and their overall just competitiveness. I mean, they have so many iconic moments, from their fights with Charlotte and Myrna, to the "my ox is broken" scene, to, again, my favorite scene of Colin almost getting arrested. They are just fantastic characters and great racers on this season, and what makes it even better is that they get that redemption arc in season 31, where them winning there in the way that they do is one of my favorite arcs in the history of reality television. And when I look back on this season now, I always think of this as Colin and Kristy's season. But finally, for the winners, Chip and Kim, who are really fun characters on the show as well. I mean, I think Chip has a really infectious energy about him, especially in confessionals, and Kim's contrast of being a more rational thinker was a really fun dynamic. But from an editing standpoint, I felt like their win was so blatant, with so much foreshadowing of them taking down Colin and Kristy. And I also feel like they were a team that were prone to really dumb mistakes, like in their first leg where they missed the detour clue, them wasting money and barely scraping by that, them not using the yield at the final 5, which put them in danger, and obviously them just completely lucking out into their win here at the final leg. Again, them as racers, I don't know how much respect I really have for them. I mean, they're not a bad team. They're definitely far above average, but they're just prone to really dumb mistakes. But as characters, they're fantastic. I remembered really liking them as a kid. They were really fun on this season, and they're a team that I think it was a travesty that they weren't on All-Stars. So that's it for season 5. I, again, love this season. It's my favorite season of the show. It's just filled with so many iconic characters and moments throughout. I think it's one of the most consistent seasons of the show. Definitely the most consistent of these earlier seasons. I mean, I think I've only found like one episode kind of boring, but everything else was just so strong. I mean, even in something like season 3, I found like multiple episodes pretty boring. But here it was just great throughout. So for me, after my rewatch, my opinions of this season are pretty much exactly the same. So that's it for The Amazing Race Season 5. I guess I might as well give a bit of an update on this rewatching series here, as I did mention at the end of my Season 4 video that I was going to continue on with the revisiting series until Season 7, and then take a break after that. I have changed my mind since then. I have decided that I will be taking the break after this video, after Season 5 here. And a lot of that has to do with, I mean, to be honest, there's just other videos I want to be making right now. And I feel like Season 5 is a good spot to stop. I feel like it's a solid break-off point. Again, I will probably return to this at some point. I would like to rewatch Season 6, Season 7. I don't know if I want to do Season 8, but we'll see. But I'll have to wait until I'm a bit less busy. I have a lot of stuff going on right now, and then mixing that on with rewatching seasons of The Amazing Race and other shows that I'm also doing videos on. It's just kind of tough to juggle things around. I feel like The Amazing Race is the one that has to get dropped here. But again, I will eventually come around to it. I do also want to open up space for me to start watching The Amazing Race Canada, so I can eventually do videos on that as well. I would still like to do an Amazing Race winner ranking. That will be at some point in the future. So I will still be doing Amazing Race videos, but this revisiting series will have to go on hiatus for a little bit. Again, I will come back to it at some point, just when, I don't know. But that's it for the video. That's it for Season 5 of The Amazing Race. Thank you for watching.